Right, once again, I apologize for all those errors with Zoom. Thought I had it all figured out. Turns out my computer settings are just not going to allow me to do that. So we will do it this way instead. Alright, so today we'll be talking about soils and some toxic soils. Because we are doing this virtually, all right, just for some participation points, go ahead, follow along, and answer the questions on the lecture as we proceed. Because it is recorded, you can stop it and pause it, rewind, whatever you need to do to answer those questions. All right, I am not going to really correct those questions. I'm just looking that you have participated in the lecture today. I will make that due on Monday, so you have some time to do so because of all the errors we had here. And then I can go over those questions in class on Monday. All right, so on Monday, really the only thing I have planned is the exam. All right, and remember, class will start at 11:30 on Monday. All right, so at 11:30, come into class. I can answer any questions you might have had on this lecture, any last minute questions, answer the discussion questions if you would like me to. We'll take the exam, and that will be it for the day. All right, I want to give you every opportunity that you can to attend all of those MLK sessions. All right, so let's talk about what is soil. All right, so soil is complex. All right, a lot of people just think of soil as dirt beneath your fingernails or that you walk on. All right, but soil is very complex. All right, it's essentially a living, breathing organism. All right, it's made out of soil particles. All right, the actual grains of soil that you feel. It might be made up of soil organic or inorganic matter, the soil solution, which is the water and all the dissolved nutrients and matter within that water, and the soil biota. All right, so there's a lot of microbes in the soil. There's larger animals or larger organisms, such as worms we see in this picture here. All right, so if we're thinking about soils, right, we got to think of how do soils form. Right? Well, soils are going to form when a solid rock is weathered, right? And this can happen through a variety of means, right? This could be physical weathering, right? So maybe it's physically broken apart, right? Maybe that's the animals walking over top of it, or maybe wind can be strong enough to slowly blow small chunks off at a time, or erosion would be a good example of physical weathering. Chemical weathering, all right, any chemical reactions that are taking place that might physically break down the rock. And then finally, biotic weathering. All right, in this image here, I have a chunk of rock that I saw in Idaho. All right, this is a volcanic rock here, and it is slowly being weathered by these lichen, right? Organisms that are breaking down the rock. Right, so lichen is a really great example of biotic weathering, but plants can do the same. All right, their roots can start to break apart some of those larger rocks. All right, now once we've broken down these rocks, all right, this is where we start to release nutrients that can be utilized by the biota relying on the soils. All right, so when we're looking at soils, a really big component of soils are soil texture. Right? So soil texture is going to depend on the parent material from which it was weathered from. And we have these three major soil particle types. All right? And we can see in this diagram here, we can classify them into other types. All right? But the major three soil types are sand, which have the largest particles. All right? Silt, and then clay, which has the smallest particles. All right? So each type of soil particle and each type of soils have different water and nutrient holding capacities. All right, so if we're looking at these soil particle characteristics, right, we're going to focus on sand and clay because they're at the extreme ends of these spectrums here. All right, so sand has a low surface to volume ratio. All right, so it has very little surface area as compared to clay, which has a high surface area. Right? We can see that in our image here. All right, we have these sand grains which are very, very large, right? But they have a lot less surface to the actual volume of the grain itself. Versus all these little silt particles, these clay particles, they're very small, right? But all that surface area adds up to a greater surface area to volume ratio than the sand. All right, and if we look at up here too, we can see, all right, on this end we have a soil that's a little bit more clay-like, and on this end we have a soil that's a little bit more sand-like. All right, we have a lot more pores. All right, we have a lot of spaces in between the soil particles versus the clay does not have a lot of space in between them at all. Right? This is going to cause a lower water holding capacity, right? Because essentially this water can drain out very easily as compared to over here with the clay, where the clay is much more compact, there's very few pores, the water's not going to drain as easily. Right? This is going to influence our nutrient absorption. All right? So because we have a higher surface area on clay, all right, nutrients tend to stick to these soil particles here. All right, so if we have a higher surface area, there's more area for nutrients. All right, so it has a higher nutrient absorption than say the sand particles here. All right, so this is one of your first questions that you can write down and answer on that document I have on Moodle. All right, pause it here if you need time, but I'm going to go straight on to the next slide. All right, how do we classify soils? All right, so if we look worldwide, all right, there's a lot of different classification schemes out there. All right, Russia, France, United States, we all have different soil taxonomies or ways that we classify our soils. Right, in the United States, all right, we use this classification scheme that we call soil taxonomy. All right, and it uses these different properties. All right, so in the United States, we look at unique soil properties. We use diagnostic soil horizons, and this essentially kind of creates a language for us to be able to talk about soils. All right, so classifying soils in the US here. All right, let's just dive into that just a little bit deeper here. All right, we're going to look at soil textures. All right, so if you've been on a beach before, I mean, the soil texture of a beach sand is really rough, all right? It's mostly sand at that point, all right? If you've been somewhere, say, deep in the forest and you've touched the soils, all right, maybe you saw that it was very wet, had a more of a, maybe a smoother texture to it, right? So we're going to look at the soil texture. We're going to look at the soil profiles, all right? So I have an image of a soil profile up here, right? As well as the different soil horizons, all right? So in the video, you should have learned that these different soil horizons, right, represent these different layers within our soil profile, right? Some soils are going to have more horizons than others, and in other soils, they might have a thicker specific horizon than another soil, right? Soil moisture and soil temperature also really play a role in classifying soils. So I put this up here just to give you a better picture of, what do soil horizons mean? All right, so if we look at these soil profiles, we can break them down into these different horizons. All right, and I have defined these horizons out here. I wouldn't expect you to know these horizons. All right, I just put this up here so it gives you a better picture of what we're looking at when we're looking at soil. And again, just like we talked about for classification, we use all these different factors to classify our soils. And it's kind of similar to how we might classify organisms. We might put organisms into families and genuses and species, right? And we classify soil kind of the same way, all right? Except we use family, subgroup, grade group, suborder, and order, right? Order kind of being similar to how a species would be, all right? The smallest unit of classification, essentially. All right, so if we focus on those soil orders, we have 12 of them worldwide. And I put this picture up here. I think it's a great picture that kind of shows, where soils are throughout the world. We look at the United States, all right, we see we have really prominent mollisoils, all right, so this dark green one here. We have iridosoils, which are this tan color, right, and in the south, right, the southeast, we have this eultisols. All right, so I think this is kind of cool to look at. All right, I put this image up here that if you're interested in learning more about those different soils, this is just kind of a broad way of how we classify them. All right, so if I looked at these iridosoils down at the bottom here, I would see that these soils are classified via this climate-dominated pathway, right? And that climate being mostly dry. That's how we get these iridosoils. Right now, from looking at, say, this oxosoil here, I see that this is a really long or really old soil. It's a well-developed soil, right? And it's a soil that's developed in an area that's very hot and humid. Right? But again, I'm not going to be testing you on these 12 orders. Right? I think they're just kind of interesting to look at. What we're really going to be focusing on today is the soil organic matter, right? Because that plays such a huge role in plant biology and a huge role when we're thinking about maybe terraforming other planets. All right, so this the surface layer of soil containing decomposing organic matter. All right, that's what we're focusing on when we're looking at the soil organic matter. All right, so this is going to contain leaf litter. All right, so those dead and decaying leaves. It's going to contain animal tissues, animals that might have died and started to decompose, feces, plant exudates, which are anything that the plant might excrete out. All right, so that could be different chemicals. Maybe it's defense chemicals that they have excreted out. But anything they're exuding out is going to be accumulated in the soil. And then finally, all those microbes in the soil. The microbial biomass is going to be part of the soil organic matter. All right, so when we're looking at soil organic matter, right, we can talk about it as being detritus. So detritus is this organic matter that is actively being broken down. Right, so maybe think about those dead leaves on the forest floor, or maybe an animal that has died and is starting to decompose. All right, soil microbes are going to work on this detritus, all right, and breaking it down. It's actively being broken down, and nutrients are being released out. Right, so this is a really good way of getting nutrients back into the soil. All right, after that breakdown is complete, all right, this is what creates soil humus, or humus, however you want to say it here. Right? So this soil humus is made by the breakdown of that soil organic matter. Right? This humus is not very fertile. Right? At this point, all the nutrients have been broken down and brought into the soil, and maybe started to be used up by other microbes or plants. Right? But what's really important here is that it contributes to soil structure. All right, so if we're thinking about soil structure, we're thinking about, maybe pieces that are adding a little bit more texture to the soil. All right, so if we're looking at this humus, all right, it plays a really important role in growth for plants. All right, if we have a rich humus soil, all right, it's, more than 8% organic matter, right, this is a really great growing soil. Right? In fact, optimal growth requires near 8% of this humus because it helps the soils hold on to water and ions better. All right, remember when I'm saying ions, I am talking about those molecules and atoms that have a charge to them. All right, so they've either lost an electron or gained an electron. They have a charge associated with them. All right, so how we get those nutrients into the soil is through decomposition. Right, we're breaking down the organic matter into smaller components, all right, by these microbes, and we can further break down these smaller components into these inorganic ions that can be used by the plants through mineralization. Right, but if we're talking about decomposition, we really have different rates of decomposition depending on the rate of soil microbial activity. So if the microbes are very active, right, they're going to increase the rate of decomposition, as well as the types of organic compounds. All right, some things on the forest floor are just easier to break down than others. All right, so the rate of soil microbial activity is really influenced by water and organic carbon. All right, organic carbon is their food source, and that is what the dead and decaying stuff that they are breaking down. That's how they get their organic carbon. And then they need water. They need water to maintain their metabolism, right? To maintain cellular respiration and all sorts of cellular processes inside of these microbes. They need water. right? So if we're looking at an arid area, so very dry, right, and they have low productivity, they often have lower rates of microbial activity, right? Because the air is dry and microbes need water, all right? So there's not as much water for them to be as active, right? In turn, that's going to decrease the rate of decomposition. All right. Another thing to take note of is that decomposition occurs more rapidly in aerobic systems than anaerobic systems. All right. So an aerobic system is a system that has oxygen in it, and an anaerobic system would be a system that is lacking in oxygen. All right. So maybe it's a flooded field, all right, and there's no oxygen available because the water has taken up all those air pockets. Right, so most microbes, they need oxygen to decompose matter, all right? And if we have decomposition happening in an anaerobic system where we're lacking oxygen, all right, only microbes that are specifically adapted to those conditions can break down organic matter, right? And it does so a lot more slowly because there's just fewer of those microbes, right? So we're going to get a buildup of this partially decomposed organic layer because decomposition is just not happening as fast. And we can see that here. We have this buildup of lots of organic material here that's kind of in this flooded area. All right, so here's the next question to ask, next two questions to think about. And again, I'm not going to pause here, but I'm just going to continue on through, but you can pause the recording here if you need. All right, so if we're thinking about soil organic matter levels, we are thinking about these different factors that might influence it. All right, so gains and losses of carbon. All right, so again, the main source of carbon are those dead and decaying matter, the climate, the vegetation, how well the soil drains, as well as agricultural practices. All right, they're all going to influence the soil organic matter, and as a result, all right, it's going to influence what soil order we would put a soil into, how we classify these. Right? So soil order is a product of the combination of these factors. And I threw this slide up here because I think it gives you kind of a good small picture of how we're classifying these soils based on soil organic matter. Right? So for example, these aridosols, right, they're really, really dry soils, and they're really low in soil organic matter. Right? So our soil organic matter is playing a role in classifying these soils. All right? As well as these histosols, they are high in a soil organic matter, but they have a really slow breakdown of it. These andisols tend to be volcanic soils high in organic matter, right? And they have these really clay layers to them. And then finally, mollisoils. All right, that's typically the soils we might find in the Midwest here. Right, soils that are very high in soil organic matter, and they're really high in soil organic matter, which makes them really great to use in agriculture. All right, so if we're talking about carbon, right, any inputs of carbon is going to be the soil organic matter. All right, so dead leaves, decaying animals, whatever it might be, is going to input carbon into the system. Now the output of carbon, right, might be oxidation of soil organic matter, right? So if we're talking about oxidation of soil organic matter, essentially this means we are releasing carbon dioxide and those organisms are gaining some energy from it. All right, gaining energy from the oxidation of this matter, not from the CO2 itself. All right, so they're releasing CO2 at the same time they're gaining energy from breaking down this matter. And finally, erosion. All right, we can get a loss of carbon from the system by erosion, just simply bringing that carbon away or taking that carbon away. All right, so if the inputs of soil organic carbon are greater than the outputs, right, this is where we get soil organic matter accumulation. Now, climate also plays a huge role here. All right, temperatures are going to affect vegetation growth and microbial activity. All right, so if we have soil organic matter, all right, that's going to increase as climates are cooler. Right, so if climates are cooler, we're slowing down plant growth, we're slowing down microbial activity, which slows down decomposition and allows for a buildup of that soil organic matter. Right? Moisture also plays a key role. So organic matter tends to increase as the soil moisture increases. Right? So if we look at, I threw up a map of Ohio here because I think Ohio is a good example of this range of soil moistures here. All right, they get a lot of soils on the shores of Lake Erie here, more around like the Cleveland area, right? Versus the southern part of the state is really dry comparatively, right? So when we have more moisture, all right, more soils are going to be leached, right? And when I'm saying leached, I am meaning that essentially the soil solution, all right, that water surrounding all of the soil particles can drain away, right? And that leads to a slower rate of decomposition as well. Now, vegetation, all right, it has a really tight relationship with climate, right? So if we have increased precipitation, that allows for increased plant productivity, right? But increased plant productivity can lead to an increased source of organic matter, right? We have more plants that are growing, actively growing. They're also actively shedding leaves, actively dying off, right? We're increasing our soil organic matter. And in our image here, we see that we have really high amounts of soil organic matter, particularly in our Midwest areas, Iowa and Minnesota. Right? Soil drainage, all right, is also going to affect soil organic matter, but when we're talking about soil drainage, we're really talking more locally instead of a country scale or even a statewide scale, all right? We're talking very local. Right? Sandy soils generally have much less organic matter, right? Because it's a well-drained soil, so it's going to take away a lot of that organic matter as it's draining out, right? These finer textured soils are going to hold water better and increase nutrient availability, right? So finer textured soils, really silt. Silt is really good at holding water and having increased nutrient availability, which, because there's more nutrients, we're going to have more plant productivity. And these finer textured soils, all right, say clay, all right, if we have a soil that's really high in clay, they might actually restrict drainage, right? If we're restricting drainage and we're so tightly compact with our soil particles that there's not a lot of air pockets, all right? There's not a lot of oxygen in those air pockets, and those roots need oxygen, microbes need oxygen, right? And if we're not getting those oxygen, we're going to get a buildup of organic matter because there wasn't enough oxygen to allow for the breakdown of it. Right, agricultural practices, all right, if we're looking at cropland, it generally has less soil organic matter than natural areas, right, because we're removing the vegetation for food consumption, and that soil organic matter, instead of the plant dying off and it returning to the earth, all right, we're harvesting that plant and eating it and taking away from the soil. Right, oftentimes when we drive past farmland, we might see farmers trying to till the soil. All right, so if we're tilling the soil, we're trying to put more air pockets into the soil. All right, we're trying to increase aeration, allowing for faster decomposition. So if we're thinking about soils, right, soils are really limiting plants worldwide. All right, plants rely on the soils. Right, plants need water and nutrients, but some soils just lack water availability, and in turn can lack also nutrients, right? So if we're thinking about water, if they lack water availability, that's less water for the plants to utilize, right? Less water for the microbes to use to help with decomposition and mineralization, even nitrogen fixation, right? We talked about nitrogen fixing bacteria yesterday. Now, the age of the soil, all right, how young or how old that soil is, can also affect what nutrients are available. All right, so another couple of questions for you to consider. All right, take some time to do so now. And I am going to keep moving. All right, so how do plants actually access the soil nutrients? All right, so we've talked about soil, we've talked about soil organic matter and how that's where we get a lot of our nutrients being broken down and entering into the soil. Right, but how do we actually access those nutrients? All right, well, we know that the roots are going to grow through the soil, all right, and those root hairs play an important role in trying to uptake water and nutrients. We know that soil is a mixture of particles and these pore spaces, right? So if we look at our image here, we have these pore spaces, right? Some pores are going to be filled with air, right? Other pores, right, the areas around these particles are going to be filled with the soil solution, which again is water and all the dissolved nutrients and other compounds in the water. So how do the roots actually access the nutrients in these soils? Right, well, this is where we get into a process called cation exchange. All right, so these silt and these clay soils, they tend to be less porous because the particles fit really tightly together. Right, so water percolates or moves through less easily. And because it moves through less easily, right, those nutrients are not going to be drained out of the soil, right? So more of those ionic nutrients are going to be retained. So when we're talking about cation exchange, right, cation is a positively charged ion, right? So those hydrogen ions, those H+, right, those are going to replace other mineral cations, positive ions, on the surface of all those different soil particles. Right? Not only soil particles, but it could be the particles of soil organic matter. Right? And we're going to see this in the next few slides here. All right, so let's take a look at cation exchange. Right? So we have our soil particles. Right? They are negatively charged, as well as any of the soil organic matter that might be present is going to be negatively charged. Because they're negatively charged, they're going to attract positively charged ions. Right, these cations are positively charged. They're going to be attracted to the soil particles. Right, now these anions, right, these are negatively charged nutrients, or negatively charged compounds. Right, they're not going to be attracted to the negative soil particles. All right, remember opposites attract. Right, and these are the same charge. They're not attracted to each other. They're just going to kind of float around. They're going to be free in that soil solution, free in that water. So when we're talking about anions, right, this is really easy for roots to take up, right, because they're not fixed to a soil particle, right? They're just kind of hanging out and waiting around, right? So really easy for the roots to access, right? But because they're not held onto by the soil particles, what can happen, especially after a rainstorm here, is they can be easily leached, right? They can drain away, right? So if we have a rainstorm, those anions are going to drain out of the soil and it's just no longer going to be accessible. So they might be really easy for soils to pick up, all right, but they're also really easily lost. Versus cations, all right, they're going to be held on to these negatively charged soil particles. These cations, all right, they're going to form this nutrient pool that's kind of always going to be there. So if these are connected or held onto by our negatively charged soil particles, we have to release these particles from, or release these ions from our soil particles. And this happens through the process called cation exchange. All right, so I'm going to come back to the slide here. All right, cation exchange. We're releasing cations to the soil water. All right, so if we're releasing those cations, all right, and those cations are typically going to be these hydrogen ions, right? Plants can actually create these hydrogen ions and release them into the soil so that they can change places with the other cations that are on these soil particles. So essentially we are exchanging one cation for another. We're releasing the hydrogen atoms, having that bind to the soil particle, which kind of kicks out this other anion, kicks out this cation, right? And this cation is now in the soil solution and the plants can take it up, right? So it's really these hydrogen particles that are playing a huge role here. Plants are releasing them, they're kicking out those other ions from the soil particles, and now they can be taken up by the plant. Right, so if we think of acid rain, right? Acid rain has a lot of these hydrogen ions, right? If we're adding a lot of these hydrogen ions to the soil, it can actually reduce soil fertility and start to pollute streams, all right? Because we're adding these to the soil, right? It's taking the place of all these nutrients that are stuck onto these particles, right? These nutrients can be washed away and enter into streams, can pollute streams with excess nutrients, and reduce the overall soil fertility because now we only have hydrogen ions instead of these other nutrients. All right, so we call this the cation exchange capacity. How easily soils are held onto, or hold onto and exchange ions. Right, so if we say a soil has a high cation exchange capacity, it has a large nutrient reserve. All right, so one of the last couple of topics I want to talk about are unique soils. All right, and when we're talking about soils on other planets, they're definitely unique. All right, but because they're unique, they're going to pose these challenges for organisms that live on them. Right, on Earth here, when we have unique soils, we often find endemic plants and animals. So when we say a plant or animal is endemic, right, that means they are only found in that area. Right, so plants that are only adapted to these unique soils. Right, they have adapted to overcome the hardship, whatever that might be, that has been presented by the soil. And typically they're biodiversity hotspots, right, because we have a lot of different species that are only found in this one area. So some of the challenges these unique soils can pose, right, might be challenges to taking up nutrients from the soil, challenges in being able to uptake enough water, too much salt, right? Too much salt can be detrimental to different cellular processes. So most plants cannot handle large amounts of salts, right, unless they've been specifically adapted to growing in salt soils. We might get heavy metal accumulation, right, which can be toxic for the plants as well as calcium accumulation. Right? Calcium accumulation, too much calcium, all right, is a bad thing. So again, we don't want to accumulate too much of it unless these plants are adapted to it. All right, now we're not really going to look at salt accumulation or calcium accumulation here. We're going to focus on two unique soils, acidic and alkaline soils. All right, so if we're looking at something that's acidic, there are more hydrogen ions present, such as in this image here. All right, we see that the more acidic it is, the more hydrogen ions there are. The more basic something is, or the less acidic, right, there are going to be fewer hydrogen ions present. Right, these hydrogen ions are red in this image here. And instead, in a basic solution, we're going to get more hydroxide ions. All right, hydroxide ions, they are negatively charged, versus those hydrogen ions are positively charged. All right, so if we're looking at these acidic soils, all right, we're going to start by looking at the acidic ones. They're typically going to be found in more humid regions, all right, areas that have high precipitation. There's a lot of leaching going on. Remember, so leaching is the draining of the soils, and they have lower decomposition rates. All right, so if we have these acidic soils, higher precipitation, all right, high rainfall leads to lots of leaching. Right? Leaching is going to take away those soil anions and leave the cations behind. Right? So now we don't have a lot of access to any of the nutrients that might be anions. Now in acidic soils, these cations that are left behind are typically this Al3+, but we're going to focus on the H+, all right? Typically leaving more of those hydrogen ions behind. Right? If we have more hydrogen ions in the soil, it's decreasing the soil pH. Right? It's making it more acidic. Right? So precipitation plays a huge role in this. Now if we're looking at the nutrient availability, right, and we know our soils are more acidic, has a lower pH, right, this can pose different challenges to plants. Right? This can decrease the cation exchange capacity, so decrease the ability for plants to uptake nutrients. Right? Decrease just the availability of nutrients. So if we look at this image here, you'll see that the more acidic we get in pH, a lot of these nutrients start to taper off, right? There's just not as many of them. Now there's still some of them, right? But sometimes, such as like iron, these metals, all right, we can have too much of them at this point, right? So it increases some nutrients to a toxic level and decreases nutrient availability of a lot of the other ones, especially these essential ones like nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. All right, so plants that live in these acidic soils have these unique adaptations. Right, oftentimes they'll exhibit carnivory, so they'll be carnivorous plants, because they have to find ways to get nitrogen, particularly, and other nutrients that they can't get from the soil. Right, so they might be carnivorous plants. These plants might be able to tolerate high levels of iron and aluminum in the soil. Right, so they've just adapted to be able to tolerate high levels of those toxic minerals. They might have an increase in root surface area, right? So fewer nutrients in the soil, we have to increase our roots so that we can search out more nutrients. We might also increase the pH directly around the root, right? So if the plant is able to influence the pH levels directly around their roots, right, they can essentially have more nutrients stay into the soils that are directly adjacent to their roots. So the other soils we'll talk about are alkaline soils, or soils that are more basic. All right. Now these alkaline soils, right, pictured in blue on our map here, are typically found in really dry and arid regions, areas that have low precipitation, less leaching, lower decomposition rates. Right? Now they could also be found in wetlands, all right? Wetlands that have like the stagnant water where water doesn't leach away as fast. Right, so if we're looking at alkaline soils, right, we have less precipitation that decreases the amount of leaching and decomposition, right? So especially with decomposition, we're just not getting as many nutrients being input into our soils, right? If we have a little amounts of leaching, all right, the soils are going to hold on to those cations. They're also going to hold on to other ions such as carbonates and bicarbonates. And these are anions where we could potentially get some of those cations from to release other nutrients from the soil particles. All right, now that's a little more confusing to understand here. Right, so with no leaching, so the soils are not being drained away, right? Soils tend to hold on to those cations and hold on to other anions where we can get our hydrogen ions from, right? I talked about with decreased decomposition rates, we just have fewer compounds that are broken down, and specifically fewer compounds that can be broken down into hydrogen ions. Right? And this tends to lead to a soil with more of these OH negative ions, these hydroxide ions, and then the present hydrogen ions, resulting in a very high pH because we just don't have as many hydrogen ions in our soil. Now alkaline soils, all right, present some of the same challenges, all right? So if we look at soils that are higher on our pH chart here, we see that they're beginning to taper off, all right, depending on what nutrient we're looking at, right? But we also see that some of them are much more present, right? However, they might be present, but they're not present in a form that is available for plants to take up, all right? So that's the troubling part of alkaline soils is we might have enough potassium, we might have enough sulfur or phosphorus, but they're not present in a format that plants can utilize. Another problem with alkaline soils is that soils contain these really hard calcareous layers, all right? So they can form these harder layers that just make it hard for roots to penetrate into those layers. So the roots can't penetrate as deep into the soils, right? So that decreases the amount of soils that are available for plant growth. All right, so another couple questions here that you can answer on your own. Pause the video here if you need to. All right, the last topic we're really going to look at are some heavy metals. right? So heavy metals, they can be toxic to plants if accumulated in a high quantity, right? And heavy metals can be accumulated through the food chain, right? So I put an image down below of this food chain. It's not necessarily plant related here, but we can see these mayflies. They might be taking up this toxic chemical, right? It might be a heavy metal here. This fish is coming along and eating those mayflies. They're eating a lot of those mayflies, right? So they're accumulating their levels of this toxic compound, right? The bass is going to eat these smaller bluegills, again accumulating even more of those toxic compounds. And then us as humans, we might eat multiple of these bass fish, right, and accumulate even more of those toxic compounds, right? So this is an example of something called bioaccumulation, right? So when we go up in the food chain, right, we're accumulating these toxic chemicals, toxic pollutants that can be toxic to ourselves or other animals. Right, so a classic example of bioaccumulation is the chemical DDT, right, that killed off a lot of the eagles, right? Now, once that toxin was banned, right, the eagle population bounced back. That was a classic example of bioaccumulation that you can look up if you need another example of this. Right, one of the things when we're looking at toxic compounds in plants is we might try to use plants to accumulate toxic compounds in order to restore an environment, right? So some plants, not all plants, can accumulate toxic compounds in their cells, right, and be able to deal with large amounts of toxic compounds, right? So it's only certain plants that can do this, right? Most plants, if they accumulate too much of these toxic compounds, will die. Right, but these plants won't. They'll actually actively take it up into their tissues, right? So if they're taking these toxic compounds into their tissues, right, we're getting rid of those toxic compounds in the soils, right? So essentially, I put a picture up here of this mining area, right, where they essentially used plants. They planted these plants that were very tolerant to toxic compounds, right? They took those toxic compounds into their plant tissues, all right? Now what we have to do is we have to cut down these plants, right, and haul them away somewhere else, because if these plants were to die, those very same toxic compounds would just decompose and end up back in the soil. So we have to cut down those plants, haul it away, right? But eventually, after many generations, we can get a soil that is more fertile, or it's restored to its original condition, right? And other species of plants can now live there because those toxic compounds are gone. So when we're looking at phytoremediation, right, we really have to think of what are those physiological tolerances of different species. So not all species can do this. Some species might process the toxins differently, right? So some species might process the toxins where they actually volatilize the toxins and release it into the air, right? And different toxins might be processed differently. So these are all questions we have to ask when we're looking at phytoremediation. Now I think phytoremediation is really cool, right? And when we're talking about soils on other planets, we might see that they have accumulations of heavy metals or different compounds that are toxic to a lot of plants. And phytoremediation is something we could think about doing. All right, so I put a couple of links up here. We're going to watch one of them. This first one focuses really on Martian soil. Right, so thinking about your final projects, these links might be kind of helpful for you here. Right, but we're going to watch this. I think it's like a 6-minute video here on should we use soil on Mars.
Our task is to detect money laundering threats
we'll have
fast.
To wade through an ad here.
So we use random forests to detect the riskiest cases and quickly alert investigators. Keeping tabs on suspicious activity, that's machine learning at Capital One.
When we send people to deep space, we can't carry a ton of stuff with us. There's only so much room on a rocket, right? And food takes up a lot of space, and it can break down over time. But one thing we can send with us are super lightweight seeds to grow plants. That's why we're here at Kennedy Space Center to learn how to grow yummy food in space and on other planets. In order to grow plants, you need soil, right? Well, there are some problems with that.
Technically, on the moon and Mars, it's not really a soil.
Okay.
A soil, by definition, has organic material in it. The surface of the moon and Mars doesn't, so they're really
It's got
regolith. It's crushed volcanic rock for the most part. And there's components in that, chemicals in that are not conducive to plant growth. So especially when we go to Mars, we're going to have to figure out if we want to use the Martian regolith as a medium to grow plants in, we're going to have to convert that regolith into a soil, a usable soil.
Right, and aren't there some problems
Yes.
already associated with using that soil? Isn't it a little bit toxic?
Yeah, perchlorates that are in the Martian soils are a real problem for plant growth.
Perchlorates are a type of salt. NASA's Phoenix lander and Curiosity rover both found signatures of the chemical on Mars. And that's not great news. High levels of perchlorates are toxic to humans, which could make growing food on the red planet problematic. But NASA is thinking of ways to clean the perchlorates by washing them away with chemical solutions.
There's perchlorates in the environment on Earth, and their scientists have already developed methods for remediating those perchlorates using microbes. So
Okay.
theoretically, we could go up there and use either chemical or microbial solutions to mitigate the microbes.
So at the end of the day, it might just be better not to use soil at all than to actually try and clean the potentially toxic Mars soil. Of course, you can always bring soil from Earth, but that's not really a great option either because it weighs so much. NASA's looking into other options for growing plants that don't use soil. We have, a basic soil here, but picking it up, that's pretty heavy. And this isn't even a very big box.
Well, even today in controlled environment agriculture, they're getting away from using soil as a medium to grow plants in. They want to go to things that are basically hydroponically grown, aeroponically grown. You want to minimize the resources, even today on the ground, to grow things in. So we're going to be looking at using some of that type of technology in spaceflight so we can eliminate the medium of soil.
NASA is testing hydroponics, a method for growing that has gained popularity among terrestrial farmers in the past few years, and also aeroponics, as gravity or a lack thereof presents its own challenges.
So we're growing things in kind of a modified hydroponics way right now. So hydroponics is growing plants without soil. And generally on Earth, this is using a nutrient solution, a liquid solution of nutrients. And sometimes you use a substrate like a baked clay or a gravel or a sand. Sometimes you can just use water and nutrient solution. And so we're testing different ways of doing this, both for a surface system like Mars, where you have some gravity, and for microgravity in space. So without gravity, you get some really interesting challenges. You get very different behavior of fluids. So water and air have been our biggest challenges, especially in the root zone, watering your plants. And when we figure that out, that's going to be huge.
Hydroponics delivers water and nutrients to plant roots using a liquid solution. And aeroponics takes it one step further. Instead of using a solution, plants are grown in a misty air environment. Aside from hydroponics, researchers are also testing what environments plants will thrive in best by testing different lights and temperatures, including environments similar to that of the ISS.
Our main goal right now is to produce safe, nutritious, and appealing food for the crew to supplement a packaged diet. So they have a really good packaged diet. They have several hundred foods, and they're actually really tasty. They do a lot of evaluation to make sure that they're going to be very, very delicious for the crew. When we go to Mars, we need a diet that's going to be good for 5 years. And
Right.
some of the vitamins don't last that long in the packaged food. So we're looking at, can we use supplemental food production, crops, plants, to add more flavor, more texture, and more nutrients to that diet.
I couldn't leave without getting a taste of these plants. Time to eat. Basically, we're just gonna cut the leaves off and put them in these little pots here.
That's all we have to do.
Okay,
so these
great.
are microgreens. So we're going to try here. We got a little bit of broccoli, a little bit of cauliflower. So microgreens actually started life as garnishes in high-end restaurants. you'll go to a restaurant, there'll be like a little marigold microgreen on there or
Right.
something. So
Now it's the meal.
it's a meal. That's the accent for food.
The biggest benefit of microgreens is that they can be harvested in a very short amount of time. So you don't have to wait weeks or months before you can eat them.
Here's our famous steak plant.
Amara mustard is what it's called.
Yeah, it's also known as Ethiopian kale.
Medium rare. That weirdly does taste like steak.
It's got that umami.
It takes a
flavor
while to
it.
kick in, yeah. Figuring out how to grow fresh food in space is not only important for the nutritional value it will provide, but the psychological value it has as well.
When you're on Mars, you're not going to be looking down on Earth. So I think the plants are going to be really important for those reasons as well.
Like having a little taste of home almost.
Exactly.
While humans have explored and adapted to new environments many times before, with space, we won't be able to rely on the resources we are accustomed to here on Earth. Growing food is going to be incredibly difficult, and we'll have to figure out how to be self-sufficient in entirely new ways, because this is an entirely new frontier. Hey everyone, thanks so much for watching our video. If you want more science content like this, be sure to check out our Verge Science YouTube.
All right, so I thought that was a really cool video. All right, so for homework, right, on Monday, class starts at 11:30, right? Remember that, right? We're going to be, I'll be answering any of your final questions, particularly pertaining to this lecture here, and then we'll be taking exam 2, same kind of format as before. All right, so over the weekend, be a good time to work on your final project. Continue making measurements on your Martian soil experiment, right? So if they've germinated, note down when they germinated. If they're starting to grow, and once they've germinated, they're going to start to grow. Make sure you're taking height measurements every day. As far as thinning out the plants, if you are hesitant to do so, that's okay. We can wait to thin the plants on Monday. But essentially, we want to keep the tallest plant growing in our pot and thin out the other plant. That way, that one plant has all the nutrients to itself. All right, on Tuesday, we'll discuss endurance, and then you have your gravity lab report due, which you could be working on during the weekend. I should be finishing upgrading lab 1 tonight. That way you have feedback that you might need to work on your lab report. All right, if you have any questions on this lecture, email me. All right, I will get back to you as soon as I possibly can. If you want to do a little bit more of a discussion on it, I am happy to Zoom at any point during the afternoon today as well. Just shoot me an email and we will set up a time. All right, that is it.